The morning they drove out to see it, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the fields along either side of the county road were still brown from winter, flat and exhausted looking, the kind of landscape that makes you feel the weight of every mile. Delia was behind the wheel. Her sister Maura sat in the passenger seat with a county assessor's map folded on her lap and a coffee going cold in the cup holder, and neither of them said very much for the last 20 minutes of the drive, because there wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said in the kitchen of Maura's apartment the night before, when they had sat at the table with the auction notice between them and a bottle of wine that did not help and made a decision that everyone they knew would call stupid. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The property was listed as a former Cooperage and residence, 2 parcels totaling 4.5 acres in Calen County, Ohio, assessed at an amount so low it was almost insulting. The structure was described in the listing as partially collapsed, significant deferred maintenance, roof failure in the eastern wing, possible foundation issues. The minimum bid for the tax sale was $3. They had bid $3. No one had competed with them. Delia was 31 years old. Maura was 28. Between them, they had a combined savings of $11,000, a truck that needed new rear tires, and the particular determination of women who have been told too many times that what they wanted did not make sense. Their father's name was Gerald Marsh. He had owned the Cooperage, or rather he had inherited it from his own father when he was 42, and he had done very little with it in the decade that followed, which was characteristic of Gerald. He was a man with a great capacity for acquiring things, and a limited capacity for the follow-through that acquisition requires. The Cooperage had been operating, in a modest way, right up until Delia's grandfather died. After that, it sat. Gerald paid the property taxes for several years because it was easier to pay them than to sell, and then he stopped paying them because he had moved on to other concerns, and by the time the county began the tax lien process, he had already, in every meaningful sense, forgotten about it. What Gerald had not forgotten was the particular satisfaction of disowning his daughters. That had happened 13 years before, when Delia was 18 and Maura 15, and it had happened in stages, the way these things often do, beginning with arguments that felt large at the time and accumulating into a silence that became permanent. Gerald was a man of firm opinions and limited patience for being disagreed with, and both his daughters had inherited, from their mother's side, the specific trait of not backing down when they believed they were right. Their mother, Celeste, had left Gerald when Delia was 12, and she had taken the girls with her, and Gerald had managed his grief and his pride by deciding, over the following years, that the children were their mother's children, not his, and that their ideas and their choices and their personalities were evidence of this. When Delia turned 18 and moved out of the house she was sharing with her mother and made clear that she intended to study land surveying at the community college rather than the 4-year university Gerald had selected for her and was prepared to pay for, Gerald had informed her, in a phone call that lasted 11 minutes, that he would not support decisions made in opposition to his counsel, and that if she chose her own path, she would be choosing it without him. Maura had watched all of this from Celeste's kitchen table when Delia called to tell her how it had gone, and Maura had said, quietly but without any uncertainty, that she agreed with Delia, and Gerald had found out about that too, and that was that. They did not hear from him again in any meaningful way for 13 years. Those 13 years were not years of waiting. That was the thing Delia wanted people to understand when she eventually told the story. They had not spent the time grieving the father who had cut them off. They had spent it becoming themselves, which is a different thing entirely. Delia had finished her land surveying program, taken a job with a county engineering office, learned the work from the ground up, and eventually started her own small practice handling residential and agricultural parcels across 3 counties. She drove a lot of back roads. She had good boots and a tripod and a particular skill for reading old plat maps, for understanding how boundaries that had been drawn 100 years ago continued to shape the land even when no one remembered drawing them. Maura had gone into carpentry through a route that surprised people who didn't know her. She had started as a laborer on a framing crew at 19, working because she needed money and doing it without the romantic notion that she had found her calling. The calling came later, when a foreman handed her a problem with a complex timber joint, and she sat with it for an hour and understood it in a way that the more experienced men on the crew had not, and the foreman had looked at her and said, without commentary, that she should consider learning joinery. She had considered it. She was now, at 28, the person that restoration contractors called when a structure had a problem that standard technique could not solve. Celeste had watched her daughters build those lives and had said very little about Gerald because there was not much worth saying. She had her own feelings about what he had done, which she kept mostly to herself, and she had the practical wisdom not to keep the wound open for her daughters when they were doing the work of closing it. He died the previous spring, in April, of a heart attack at 68. He left a second wife, Norma, who had been his partner for 9 years and who had, over that time, organized Gerald's finances with efficient thoroughness. He left a house in Columbus that Norma now owned jointly. He left a car, a modest investment account, and a will that referenced his daughters in a single sentence. The will noted that Gerald Marsh acknowledged having 2 daughters and elected not to include them in the distribution of his estate. He left them nothing. He had meant to leave them nothing. What he had not included in that calculation, because he had genuinely ceased to think about it, was the Cooperage. The Cooperage had already passed into county ownership through the tax lien process 4 years before his death. It was no longer in his estate to give or withhold. It was available at a county tax sale for anyone who wanted it badly enough to show up and bid the minimum. They had found out about it through a woman named Patrice Odom who worked at the county recorder's office and who had, by the kind of coincidence that is not entirely coincidence, gone to school with Celeste 30 years earlier and had seen Gerald's death notice in the local paper and had thought about those girls, and had then gone looking for anything Gerald had ever owned in Calen County, and had found the Cooperage listing, and had sent a letter to Delia's address that Celeste had provided. Delia had read that letter standing at her kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning and had sat down without meaning to and had held it for a while, and then she had called Maura. Maura's first response was, "What kind of condition is it in?" That was so characteristic of Maura that Delia had laughed for the first time in several days. The answer, when they arrived on the property and got out of the truck and stood looking at it in the pewter-colored morning, was worse than described. The main structure was a 2-story frame building, originally the residence, that had held together reasonably well except for the back section, where the roof had buckled inward over what appeared to have been a mudroom or utility addition. The Cooperage itself was a separate long building running perpendicular to the residence, lower-roofed and heavy-timbered, and it was this building that was described as having collapsed, though collapsed was not quite accurate. The eastern end had given way, perhaps 15 feet of it, the roof coming down in a slow fold that had deposited timber and shingles into the interior in a heap. The western 3/4 of the building were standing. The heavy timber frame had resisted whatever pressures the eastern end had succumbed to, and the walls along the western portion were solid, the wood dark with age but intact. Maura walked the perimeter of the Cooperage with her phone's camera, documenting the foundation. She was a carpenter and had been doing restoration work for 6 years. She had the specific eye of a person who has learned to read the condition of a structure not from its surface, but from its bones. "The frame is old growth," she said, coming back around the eastern end. "Whatever this was built from, they don't cut it like that anymore. Can it be saved?" Delia said. Maura looked at the collapsed section for a long moment. "The western portion, yes. The eastern end would need to come down and be rebuilt. That's not nothing." She paused. "But the timber quality on what's standing is extraordinary." Delia turned and looked at the residence. Through the dirty windows, she could make out the shape of rooms, a staircase, the edge of a fireplace around. "Dad owned this for 10 years, she said, "and never came out here. Dad owned a lot of things he never paid attention to," Maura said. They stood in the Cooperage yard for a while longer, not because they needed more time to look, but because walking away from the first impression felt premature. The yard itself was overgrown in the particular way of places that have been neither tended nor entirely abandoned. Volunteer trees had come up along the fence line, skinny and ambitious. A hand-operated water pump stood near the residence side door, its iron handle gone to rust. Behind the Cooperage, just visible past the collapsed eastern wall, a stone wall ran along the property boundary, field stone again, dry-laid in the same hand as the cellar walls they had not yet found, chest-high in most places and missing stones in others where the freeze and thaw cycles of 40 Ohio winters had shifted what patience had assembled. Maura photographed the stone wall without saying why. Delia had learned over years of working with her sister that Maura photographed things she intended to think about later, and that thinking about them later usually meant they mattered. They went inside the residence first, testing each floorboard before committing their weight to it the way Maura had taught Delia to do years ago when they had helped Celeste with some repair work on the house in Granger. The floors were pine, worn smooth in the main rooms, and they held. The staircase was intact. The fireplace in the main room was a large one, fieldstone, floor to ceiling, and it had not moved. Someone had built it to last, and it had lasted. Upstairs were 3 rooms and a small bathroom with fixtures from the 1940s, the kind of things that people rip out and pay good money to replicate now. The window glass was original, wavy and imperfect in the way that old glass is, and the light coming through it had a quality that modern windows don't reproduce. The first room had been a bedroom. An iron bed frame was still there, mattress long gone. The springs rusted into a shape that held the ghost of something. On the windowsill were 3 hand-forged nails laid in a row, the kind that hadn't been made commercially since before the Second World War. Maura picked one up and turned it in her fingers. "Someone laid these out deliberately," she said. Delia looked at them. "Why would someone do that?" "The same reason people do anything carefully," Maura said. "Because it mattered to them." The second room was empty except for a built-in cabinet along the back wall, its doors warped by moisture and time. Inside were glass jars on the shelves, empty, labeled in pencil in a hand that had faded to near illegibility. Delia could make out the year 1956 on one, and what appeared to be a batch designation on another, 2 letters and a number. She photographed them without touching. The third room, the smallest, at the back of the house looking out over the Cooperage yard, was where Maura found the crate. It was pushed into the corner under a collapsed shelf, as if someone had placed it deliberately out of the way before the shelf came down and hidden it without meaning to. It was a wooden shipping crate, the old kind, with stenciled lettering on the side that was too faded to read. Maura lifted the lid carefully, testing the hinges before she trusted them. Inside were mason jars of nails and hardware sorted by size and type, a practice ledger with water-damaged covers, and underneath all of it, wrapped in a piece of canvas that had dried stiff, a narrow metal document box with a latch that was corroded but not locked. She brought it downstairs and set it on the kitchen counter and looked at Delia. "What is it?" Delia said. "I don't know yet," Maura said. The latch gave with the edge of a flathead screwdriver after a few minutes of careful work. Inside the box were papers, old, dry, and remarkably intact given the condition of the building around them. The canvas wrapping had done its job. Maura lifted the first sheaf carefully and set it on the counter. They were not documents she expected to find. She had been expecting equipment records, or a deed, or old correspondence. What she found instead was a set of blueprints, hand-drawn on drafting paper, detailed and precise, labeled in a handwriting she did not recognize. The plans were for a barrel-aging cellar, drawn to include dimensions, load calculations, drainage specifications, and a note in the margin that read, "Below the Cooperage floor, eastern end, excavated 1931, E. H. Marsh." E. H. Marsh. Edward Henry Marsh. Their grandfather. Maura looked at Delia. "He built a cellar under the Cooperage," Delia said slowly. "Under the eastern end," Maura said. "The end that collapsed." They stood with that for a moment. "Which means," Delia said. "Which means nobody has been down there since before the collapse," Maura said. "Whenever that happened." They went back to the Cooperage. Standing in the standing portion, which was clear of debris and smelled of old wood and iron and the particular mineral dryness of a building that has not been opened in years, they moved carefully toward the eastern end where the heap of fallen timber and roofing material began. The collapse had come down at an angle, filling the eastern quarter of the interior. Underneath it, according to the blueprints, was an access point, a set of stairs cut into the Cooperage floor leading to the cellar below. Maura walked the edge of the debris pile, shining a flashlight into the gaps between fallen timbers. "Here," she said. Where the debris heap met the floor, there was a narrow gap, not large enough to pass through, but enough to see into. Maura lay flat and shone the light through it. The beam caught the edge of a wooden stair tread, intact, leading downward. "The stairs are there," she said. "The collapse came down in front of the access, not on top of it. Can we clear enough to get through?" Delia said. Maura sat up and looked at the debris. She was quiet for a moment. doing the calculation that carpenters do, reading the weight and distribution of what was piled there, determining what could be moved without shifting what shouldn't be moved. Yes, she said, carefully. It'll take most of the day. It took most of the day. They worked through the afternoon with the tools from the truck, a pry bar, a hydraulic jack Maura kept in a crate behind the seat, a handsaw for a section of timber that was wedged at an angle that made it immovable without cutting. Maura directed every step, telling Delia which pieces to move and in what order, bracing certain sections before others came free. The work was slow, and it was physical, and neither of them talked much while they did it, focusing on what needed focusing on. By 4 in the afternoon, with the light coming through the gaps in the Cooperage roof going gold and slanted, they had cleared a passage. Not a comfortable one, but enough. Maura went first because she knew what she was looking at in structural terms. She went down the stairs one at a time, testing each tread before her full weight, and Delia followed with the second flashlight. At the bottom of the stairs, they straightened and stood in the dark and turned on the lights. For a moment, neither of them moved. The flashlight beams swept across the stone walls, the timber supports, the low ceiling, and then caught the first rack of barrels, and then the second, and then traveled the full length of the room and came back, and the two of them stood at the foot of the stairs and said nothing. The cellar smelled of oak and earth and something deeper, something that did not have a simple name, the accumulated chemistry of decades, wood and time, and whatever was inside those barrels working slowly and without interruption in the dark. It was a good smell. It was the smell of something that had been left alone long enough to become entirely itself. The cellar was roughly 40 feet long and 20 wide, cut from the ground and lined in stone, field stone like the fireplace upstairs, fitted tight, without mortar in the dry-laid tradition that requires patient craft and a good eye for how stones want to sit. The ceiling was low, maybe 6.5 feet, supported by heavy timber posts. The floor was tamped earth, dry and solid. Along the walls, on low wooden racks that had been built into the stone lining, were barrels. Not dozens. More than that. The racks ran the full length of both long walls, 3 tiers high, and they were full. Delia moved to the nearest rack and held her flashlight close to the barrel head. The wood was dark and tight, the hoop iron still sound. She could see the Cooperage stamp burned into the wood clearly, a small oval mark with letters inside it, and below it a batch number, and below that a date. She read the date. She read it again. Maura, she said. Maura came to stand beside her. She looked at the barrel head and was quiet for a moment. 1944, she said. Look at the next one, Delia said. Maura moved along the row, her flashlight close to each barrel head in turn. She stopped. She moved further. She stopped again. 1939, she said. Her voice had changed. Keep going, Delia said. Maura went to the far end of the first wall rack, the section against the back of the cellar. She crouched and shone the light on the lowest tier. Delia, she said. What? 1934. The word hung in the stone room. Delia walked the length of the cellar and crouched beside her sister and looked at the barrel head and read the date. And then she looked at the rack above it and the rack above that, and she counted the barrels in that section, and the math of what she was looking at moved through her in a way she could not immediately translate into words. Their grandfather had filled these barrels when he was a young man. He had set them in these racks in this cellar under this building when the fields above were still being farmed and the Cooperage was still running, and Ohio rye whiskey was an ordinary thing. And then he had sealed the cellar and the world had changed around it, and the Cooperage had passed to Gerald, who had never come out to look, and the county had taken the land for unpaid taxes, and the eastern wall had folded in over the access stairs, and the cellar had sat in the dark with its barrels and its tamped earth floor and its dry-laid stone walls while 90 years went past above it. Delia sat on the bottom stair and looked at the room. Maura counted the first wall and lost count and started over. How many? Delia said. Maura was already moving along the row, her flashlight close to the barrel heads, reading the stamps burned into the wood. These are branded, she said. Cooperage mark, batch number, date. She stopped at one near the middle of the first rack. This one says 1947. 47, Delia said. There are older ones, Maura said, moving further along. Here, 1939, and, she moved the light. 1934. They stood in the stone room under the ground in the quiet, and looked at what their grandfather had built and stocked and sealed and apparently never told anyone about. And for a moment neither of them said anything because there was nothing adequate to say. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Their grandfather, Edward Henry Marsh, had run the Cooperage from 1928, when he took it over from his own father, until 1961, when he retired and handed the property to his son Gerald, who had been 22 and entirely uninterested in making barrels. Edward had been dead for 40 years. Gerald had never mentioned the cellar. Delia was not certain Gerald had known about it. It was possible, she thought as she stood there in the light of the two flashlights, that Edward had never told Gerald about the cellar at all, had sealed the access behind him when he left, and said nothing, for reasons she could only guess at. What she didn't know was that the barrels were real, and that they were old, and that old barrels from an Ohio cooperage in the middle of the 20th century had a specific kind of value that neither she nor Maura fully understood yet, but that they were going to need to understand very quickly. They drove back to Maura's apartment that evening with the blueprints and the practice ledger and a single stave Maura had carefully removed from one of the older barrels for identification purposes, and they sat at the kitchen table and searched until midnight. The cooperage mark burned into the barrel heads was distinctive enough to trace. By 10 o'clock, they had found a reference to it in the catalog of a specialty auction house in Pennsylvania that dealt in antique and vintage barrel-aged goods and cooperage artifacts. The auction house had a blog, and the blog had a post from 3 years earlier about Ohio cooperages of the early 20th century, and the post mentioned, in passing, that a small number of pre-Prohibition and immediately post-Prohibition cooperages had continued aging their own whiskey stock in private cellars as a practice that predated federal licensing requirements, and that documented examples of surviving stock from this period, if proven authentic, were considered museum quality artifacts as much as they were consumable products. Delia read that paragraph 3 times. Maura looked up from her own search. "There's an appraiser," she said, "in Columbus. He specializes in cooperage artifacts and aged spirits. His name is Thomas Vale. He's been cited in 3 different auction records I can find. Call him tomorrow," Delia said. "I already sent an email," Maura said. Thomas Vale came out the following week. He was a compact, precise man in his 60s who arrived in a plain car and walked into the cooperage without ceremony and did not say much for the first 40 minutes, which Delia later learned was characteristic of how he worked. He examined the barrel heads systematically, reading each stamp, making notes. He descended into the cellar twice, the second time with a sampling tool that allowed him to extract a small quantity from one of the older barrels without disturbing the seal in any lasting way. He came back up and stood in the cooperage and looked at his notes. "How many barrels total?" he said. "We counted 211, Maura said, "across 3 tiers on both walls." He wrote something down. "The stamps are consistent with Edward Marsh's cooperage operation," he said. "The barrel construction is period accurate. The wood species used for the staves is white oak, which is correct for this type of aging." He paused. "The sample I took from the 1934 batch has the characteristic organoleptic profile of long-aged Ohio rye whiskey, which is exactly what this was." He paused again. "The 1934 batch, if authenticated, represents 90 years of continuous barrel aging. That is not a thing that exists in the commercial market. It barely exists in private collections." Delia looked at Maura. "What does that mean?" Delia said. She did not mean it as a question about what he had said. She meant it as a question about what it implied. Thomas Vale understood the distinction. He was careful with his answer, as appraisers who know what they're dealing with tend to be careful. He said that an authenticated collection of this scale, representing multiple decades of barrel-aged rye whiskey from a documented pre-war Ohio cooperage, in intact original barrels in a purpose-built stone cellar, would represent a category of rarity that the specialty market had not seen in his professional experience. He said that the authentication process was not simple and would require provenance documentation, chemical analysis, and coordination with a licensed distillery agent to handle anything that moved towards sale. He said he could manage that process. He said he would need to come back with a colleague. He said the preliminary valuation range, pending full authentication, was something he was not prepared to give on a first visit. He came back the following week with a colleague, a woman named Claire Ashworth from the Ohio Historical Distillers Registry, and the two of them spent an entire day in the cellar. They photographed every barrel, recorded every stamp, took systematic samples, and reviewed the practice ledger Maura had found in the upstairs crate, which turned out to contain batch notes in Edward Marsh's handwriting documenting the composition and filling dates of each series of barrels, going back to 1929. The practice ledger, Claire Ashworth said at the end of the day, standing in the cooperage with her notebook full, was the authenticating document that changed everything. Without it, you had old barrels. With it, you had a provenance chain that was as complete as anything she had encountered in 20 years of historical distillers' work. The preliminary valuation came 10 days later, in a written report that Thomas Vail sent to Delia's email on a Thursday morning. She was at her survey job, in the cab of the truck between sites, and she opened it on her phone with one hand not entirely steady. The low end of the range, for the collection as a whole, was a number that made her read it twice to confirm she had the decimal in the right place. The high end, subject to full authentication and depending on how the collection was brought to market, was considerably more. Thomas Vail noted in the report that the correct approach, given the scale and nature of the collection, was almost certainly not a single bulk sale, but a staged offering through a combination of auction, private collector placement, and possible partnership with a heritage distillery operation interested in the historical legitimacy that a documented collection of this provenance would confer. He noted that he had taken the liberty of making a preliminary inquiry with two parties who had expressed interest on a no-names basis, and that both had responded with significant enthusiasm. He wrote, at the end of the report, that in his professional judgment, this was the most significant find of American cooperage heritage he had encountered in his career. Delia sat in the truck for a while. Then she called Maura. Maura was at a job site and picked up on the second ring. Delia read her the relevant paragraph. There was a silence on the line. $3, Maura said. $3, Delia said. Another silence. Maura, Delia said. I know, Maura said. I know. What they knew was not only the number, though the number was real and it changed things in immediate and practical ways. What they knew was that their grandfather had built something in the ground, something he had tended and sealed and left to time, and that their father had owned the ground above it for 10 years and ignored it, and that the county had taken it for unpaid taxes, and that a woman at the recorder's office who had gone to school with their mother had thought about two girls she didn't know and sent a letter, and that they had driven out on a pewter-colored morning and bid $3, and that all of those things had led to this. The process of authentication and sale took 14 months. It was not simple. Nothing involving this kind of provenance and this kind of regulation is simple. There were attorneys. There were licensing questions. There were long conversations with Thomas Vail and Claire Ashworth and a heritage distillery in Kentucky that became a formal partner in the process, providing the licensed infrastructure that allowed the collection to be brought to market in a way that satisfied the relevant authorities. There were taxes and fees and professional costs that reduced the final number from the high end of the range considerably. There were also, along the way, people who questioned it. Not many, but some. A neighbor of Gerald's in Columbus who had heard about the cooperage through Norma and had taken it upon himself to contact an attorney on behalf of, as the letter put it, interested parties, asserting that the collection might reasonably be considered part of Gerald's estate and therefore subject to its terms. This letter went to Delia's attorney, who responded within a week with a detailed account of the property's chain of title, the county tax lien history, the date of the tax sale, and the fact that the cooperage had ceased to be Gerald's property 4 years before his death. The interested parties did not write again. There was a piece in the Calen County Register, a short one, noting that a historic cooperage on the county road had been purchased at tax sale and was under restoration. The piece was accurate and asked no questions it wasn't supposed to ask. It was the kind of local coverage that comes and goes without consequence in most cases, but this one was picked up by a specialty publication in the spirits industry that ran a longer piece about the discovery, and that piece was read by people who knew what 90-year-old barrel-aged Ohio rye whiskey meant in the current market. And those people called Thomas Vail, and Thomas Vail called Delia. And the calls had a quality she had not heard before in those conversations. Not the careful, measured tone of a professional managing expectations. Something closer to urgency. The interest is real, he told her on a Thursday evening. And it is broad. There are 3 parties I consider serious. All of them understand what this is. What remained, when all of it was settled, was still a number that neither of them had ever expected to have. They used part of it to restore the Cooperage, not to return it to operating production, though that idea did not disappear from their conversations. The Cooperage itself, the standing western three-quarters and a rebuilt eastern end that Maura designed and supervised herself, using old-growth timber sourced from salvage, became the thing they had decided it should become, a documentation of what had been there, built properly and maintained with attention. A place that told a story in its materials and its craft and the smell of old wood and the particular quality of light through windows that looked out on the same yard that Edward Marsh had looked out on when he was doing the kind of work that no one does anymore. The fieldstone cellar remained intact below. It was empty now, the barrels gone to their various destinations, but the stone walls and the timber supports and the tamped earth floor were exactly as Edward had left them. Thomas Vale had told them that the cellar itself had documentary value and should be preserved, and they had agreed without needing to be told. Norma, Gerald's second wife, heard about the Cooperage through the obituary notice that the Heritage Distillery put out about the collection, which mentioned the Marsh family name in Calen County. She sent a letter to a mutual acquaintance expressing her surprise and her view that Gerald would have been very interested in what had been found. She did not say anything about the will's single sentence. The letter did not require a response and did not receive one. Celeste came out to see the Cooperage in the fall of the first year, when the restoration was far enough along to show. She walked through the building slowly, touching the timber framing the way she touched things that mattered, and she stopped in front of the stairway to the cellar, now properly cleared and lit, and stood there for a long moment. She said, "Your grandfather was a quiet man." Delia said she hadn't known him well enough to say. Celeste said, "He kept things he valued. He was careful about who he told and who he didn't." She turned to look at her daughters. "I think he would have liked you both very much." She stayed the afternoon. They walked the property together for the first time, all three of them, along the stone wall at the back that Maura had begun repairing, setting the displaced stones back with the same dry-laid method that Edward had used when he built it. Celeste knew more about the history of the property than she had ever said, which turned out to be a thing she had kept to herself the way she kept many things. She had met Edward Marsh once, when Delia and Maura were very small, at a family gathering she had attended with Gerald before everything changed. She remembered him as a man who talked about the Cooperage the way people talk about something they love and are also careful with, because they understand it can be damaged if you're not. She remembered thinking at the time that his son was not like him. He was right to be careful, Maura said. He was, Celeste said, though I don't think he knew how careful he was being. She meant that the cellar, sealed in 1961, had survived because no one who didn't know about it had ever gone looking. And the reason no one had gone looking was that the property had passed to Gerald, who had never cared, and then to the county, which had filed it away, and then to two women who arrived with a truck and a $3 bid on a gray morning and opened it. The chain of custody was, viewed from a certain angle, a long accident. But Delia had worked with enough old plat maps and enough complicated property histories to know that the line between accident and design is not always clear, and that sometimes what looks like accident is simply the absence of interference. That was the thing Delia returned to in the months that followed. When the process was finally done and the papers were signed and the money was settled and the Cooperage stood whole and restored on its 4.5 acres in Calen County. Not the number, not the authentication report, not the first morning they had stood in the pewter-colored air and looked at a building the county had described as collapsed. She returned to the thought of her grandfather in that cellar, in 1939, in 1947, in 1961, when he closed it for the last time, sealing what he had built against the kind of time that changes everything around a thing while the thing itself remains. She did not know why he had sealed it and said nothing. She suspected, from what she had come to understand of him through the practice ledger and Claire Ashworth's research, that he had his reasons, that the cellar was his, in the way that people keep certain things as their own, not out of secrecy exactly, but out of the understanding that some things require the right person at the right time. He had not known his granddaughters. He had died before they were old enough to know themselves. But he had built something that held, and he had left it in the ground, and it had waited. The Cooperage is open to visitors now on Saturdays, by appointment. Maura runs the restoration side and has taken on apprentices, 2 in the first year, teaching the timber framing and drystone work that the building required. Delia runs a small land survey practice out of the residence office, the same room that looks out over the Cooperage yard, with windows that still have the original glass. On the wall above her desk, in a frame she had made for it, is a copy of the blueprint from the metal box, the one in E.H. Marsh's handwriting. The dimensions are precise and the margin note is clear. Below the Cooperage floor, eastern end, excavated 1931. She had looked at those words many times in the months since she found them. She had thought about what it meant to build something with that kind of intention, to put it in the ground and seal it and leave it to whatever came next, trusting that what came next would be worthy of it. She had thought about her father, who had owned the ground above it and never looked. She had thought about the $3. She did not think about any of it with bitterness. The bitterness had been real and she did not deny that, but it had done its work and it was done. What she thought about it with now was the particular clarity that comes when you understand that the story did not go wrong. It went exactly the way it needed to go, which is not the same thing as the way it should have gone, but which is sometimes, in the end, the same thing as the way it was always going to. Gerald had disowned them and had meant it. And because of that, they had built their own lives, without his money and without his opinions and without the particular weight of being owned by someone who saw them as belonging to him. They had become the women who drove out on a gray March morning to a collapsed Cooperage and bid $3 and went to work. They had become the women their grandfather would have recognized. Downstairs, Maura was in the Cooperage with her apprentices. Delia could hear the sound of mallets and timber and voices talking through a problem. The sound of people building something that would last. She turned back to the window and looked out at the yard and thought about Edward Henry Marsh in 1931, breaking the Cooperage floor with a spade and beginning to dig, setting the first field stones of the cellar walls, working in the particular focused silence of a man building something he intended to keep. She thought, he knew what he was doing. She looked at the blueprint on the wall. She thought, and so do we. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.